Hello, and welcome to another fur-tastic episode of Furries in the Media, the series that reviews video clips based on how the furry fandom is represented. I'm your host, Aberguine, and for today's episode, let's take a look at Kare 11's report of ConFURence 8 way back from 1997. Well, that's a blast from the past. Wasn't that 20 years ago? Yeah, it sure was. Hey, wait a minute. You were able to break the fourth wall to drag me back on set a while ago. You wouldn't happen to know how to travel through time, would you, Sam? Well, in a way, I guess you could say that. Sam, let's go back in time so that we can review this video clip in 1997! Yeah, come on! We'll grab some ecto coolers and some of that Szechuan sauce while we're there. Alright. Huh, so this is what the 1990s were like. Wait, wasn't this house built in like 2010? How is it here? Well, if you had given me just a minute to explain, I'd have told you that I can only travel back in time in 15-minute increments. Oh. But wait, if we're 15 minutes in the past... Aberguine, wait, you're probably not gonna like what you see. You okay, Aberguine? Let's just review this one in the present day, please. I think that's a good idea.
In tonight's extra, the growing subculture of people who call themselves furries.
Well, your next-door neighbor or a colleague at work might be one, and you'd never know it. Now, furries talk to each other on the internet, go to parties together, and dress up as their favorite four-legged friends. Carolyn's Mark Daly recently traveled across the country with a group of Minnesota furries. It's a tale you won't forget.
Their definition seems to convey that furries are people who have an interest in anthro-animals, but it doesn't necessarily focus on how furries express that interest, which is nice because it doesn't place rigidly defined constraints onto one's understanding of furries. And by introducing furries as something a next-door neighbor or coworker might be, it establishes a friendly tone and encourages the audience to approach the topic with an open mind.
Julie Bowman of St. Louis Park was 12 years old when her grandma taught her to sew. Now, Julie's sewing tails for a group of friends who call themselves furries. Julie also made this purple guy for a friend named Lance.
He's posable.
Yep. To this day, fursuits and other furry art pieces are still made by individuals just like her. A furry's persona is often a very personal expression of themselves, and many times a generic mascot costume just won't cut it.
It's like being a little kid and having permission to do it for the entire weekend with a whole bunch of other adults that are acting like little kids.
I guess you could think of it like this. Even if you're a grown-up, Disney World is a place where you're allowed and even encouraged to feel like you're a kid again. In a way, that's kind of what the furry community has to offer.
But what's this furry stuff really all about?
I can't tell you that. If I tell you that, we'll have to kill you.
Oh, come on now. It's not that hard to explain what furry is all about.
It's just an interest that a lot of people share.
Hey, that's a good start. Does he have anything else to say?
In a long time, my dear, give me a kiss.
That's nice, but can we get back to what the other guy has to say?
Come on.
They're not coming back to him, are they? Nope. Why do you think they would leave that guy's response just hanging like that? Well, let's explore a few possibilities. Either the rest of the guy's response was so boring that they decided not to use it, or the news station had bad intentions and wanted to make furries look bad, or the rest of the footage of the guy's response was simply not usable. Well, if the guy's response was just boring, maybe they could have put footage over the top of his response to make it interesting for the viewer. And it certainly seemed like they got a lot of extra footage while they were at the convention, but since they obviously didn't do this, I think it's safe to rule out that the guy's answer was boring. Let's move on to the next possible reason. Well, if they wanted to plant the seeds of doubt in people's minds, this was a good way to do it. I agree. Showing someone making what could be seen as a defensive joke followed by a not-so-thrilling explanation of what furries are really about certainly lends itself to the idea that furries are secretive about what they do. But why would the news station stop there if they wanted to make furries look bad? Why not introduce the idea that furries are bad as soon as the segment starts and make that the focus of the entire report? Given how weird a lot of the people in the story look, it wouldn't be too hard for people to swallow the idea that furries are bad. But it doesn't seem like the news station did that. Right, and that's why I don't think they were trying to make furries look bad. So, what about the last possible explanation? Well, this one requires a bit of speculation. Haven't all of these since neither of us were there when it happened? True, but I think this was one of the first times a news crew covered the furry fandom. Before this point, it seems like hardly anybody in the fandom ever had a reason to fully explain what furry is all about to anyone outside of the fandom. To be fair, it is pretty difficult to sum up what the fandom is all about in a neat 5-second response, and it wouldn't surprise me if the rest of this guy's response was basically useless, because maybe it was the same idea stated differently, or maybe it rambled on for too long. Or maybe that was the long and short of his response. Yeah, maybe there just wasn't anything else left for the news station to use in their report. Even if that was all there was to use, I still think they could have utilized it a bit more strategically than wedging it between footage of a guy giving a funny yet defensive answer and footage of this guy smooching a bear.
Not all furries wear full-body costumes.
Dehydrate very quickly in these things.
But it is fun to just cut loose once in a while, go wild, put on stripes, and just be a total zebra in the crowd.
And not all of them necessarily wear body paint if they don't have a fursuit either. A lot of people just wear ordinary clothes at a furry convention. And there's just not as much body paint used these days. Probably because it ends up kind of falling into the uncanny valley, and it also probably has something to do with violating public decency laws.
When he's not just a zebra in a crowd, Linz is an electronics technician.
There are a lot more furry folks or furry fans than you might expect.
Tiger Wolf is a retired Air Force officer who talks to other furries on the internet.
There were, and still are, a lot of people in the fandom who work with computers and technology, though maybe not quite as many people today. I personally think that the spread of the internet not only coincided with, but maybe even stimulated the growth of the furry fandom. As more people were talking online, the idea of anthropomorphism was passed around, and it wouldn't be surprising that the first people to join the furry community were people who worked exclusively with computers. And as the internet has become more mainstream, so too has the furry fandom.
Probably blind stitch. For all the sewing that I do, I have no idea what all the technical terms are.
Julie Bowman taught other furries the finer points of costume design.
I have a chin.
And you get a nice kind of bobble when you walk with it and so on. It's actually fairly comfortable to wear.
Fursuits are still made by private individuals even today, but back then, people who made their own suits had to pioneer a lot of the methods and techniques that are used today. It also seems that there wasn't as much pressure back then to have the best fursuit, which seemed to work out just fine anyway, as during this time, the fandom primarily focused on popular characters and placed less emphasis on original characters. If you were able to get your hands on a Bugs Bunny costume, you were all set.
Many of those attending the conference here told us that being furry is just innocent child's play. Adults pretending to be kids. But a lot of what goes on here is undeniably adult-oriented, and it's not for everyone.
Anyways, opening bid, $2.
At the pet auction, for instance, furries bid for back rubs. $17.50. And other pet services.
The motives that are involved in many different areas would tend to be a little bit controversial. I don't really go in that direction.
And the furry strip show is definitely not kid stuff.
While I wish it never had to be mentioned in the first place, I do like that this segment is presented very matter-of-factly. The overall message I get from this is not so much stay away from furries at any cost, but rather don't expect all of these activities to be kid-friendly. The segment doesn't seem to actively discourage people from interacting with furries so much as it encourages them to proceed with caution if they do decide to go to a furry convention for themselves.
Timothy Fay is a programmer analyst for the University of Minnesota. Fay chose to attend more ordinary events at the conference. Events like a poolside time warp dance, sort of a furry horror picture show.
They're weird. They're weird.
Oh, it's not weird. It's just a jump to the left. With your hands on your hips. Let's check out the review stats. Information accuracy is 100%, and the spirit of the clip is 80%, giving us an average of 90%. And now time for my thoughts. I've heard a number of furries say that this news report was the one that started the trend of presenting the furry fandom like a freak show, and I can certainly see where they're coming from with that sentiment, but I think there's a bit more to this that deserves further consideration. Let's look at the clip itself. The guy's joke of "we'd have to kill you if we told you" certainly comes across as defensive, if not outright suspect by itself, and what's shown of this guy's explanation of what furry is about is woefully insufficient at providing a full answer. Couple that with the stories reveal that there are adult-oriented events that take place at this convention, and you have the perfect recipe for people to jump to the conclusion that furries are just in it for sex. As I explained earlier, I don't think that the news station was trying to make furries look bad, but I do think that they could have stood to have made some wiser decisions when editing their footage. The second thing to consider are the possible circumstances that led to this. Mind you, I was only a kid when this was going on, so a lot of this is speculative conjecture. For those of you who aren't familiar, here's a crash course in furry fandom history. The furry fandom had its beginnings in science fiction, and eventually got a large enough following that people started having meetups alongside the sci-fi conventions, and eventually these meetups became ConFURence. It wouldn't surprise me if the very first ConFURence was carried out with little fanfare in complete isolation. And as we know from looking at the fauna of the continent of Australia, isolation breeds weirdness. For the majority of the duration of ConFURence's lifespan, furries were simply left to their own devices, with each year's convention becoming a little bit wilder than the last. Fast forward to ConFURence 8 in 1997. This is one of the first times that journalists come in to report on the furry fandom, and now activities that were once relatively private were now public knowledge, and furries were having to explain themselves to people outside the fandom. I think that all of this was a result of furries finally being held accountable for their actions after having about a decade of free reign, and the news station trying to make the best out of the footage they got. In this case, I don't think the news station is totally at fault. The convention seemed like it had been running unchecked, and they just brought in cameras. I don't really think you can be mad at the photographer just because you decided to wear this shirt on picture day. I imagine there are a lot of furries who look back on all of this and maybe even feel ashamed that our fandom was like this at one point. But look at how we've improved as a fandom since this time. We've become more self-aware as a community of how the public perceives our fandom, and this affects all aspects of our fandom. It's pushed us to create better art and better looking fursuits than the ones that were around back then. And I think we're also steadily building better relations with various media outlets, to the point where one of the chairpersons of Anthrocon makes it his priority to maintain a good relationship with the local media. And of course there are things that we still need to work on as a fandom, but because of these past mistakes, these cringeworthy moments that we'd rather pretend never even happened in the first place, we not only know what not to do, but we have a better idea of how to move forward. It's a learning process, and we're constantly learning. Who knows, maybe even 20 years from now, a lot of what we do today will be seen as cringy, but that's okay. So long as we can acknowledge our past mistakes and strive to make each day a little bit better than the day before, I think our fandom is headed in the right direction. Well, that's it for today's episode of Furries in the Media. Have fun, stay awesome. Bye-bye!
It's just a jump to the left. With your hands on your hips.